Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Not D&D, brought to you by EN World. I'm your host Jessica, and this week we have Ethan joining us from Flaming River Studios to talk about Deep Space. Thanks so much for coming on and joining us.
Hi everyone.
So I was really excited. You sent me the link to this really interesting project. It's up on itch for people to download the quick start guide and take a look at now. So whilst we're chatting, feel free to take a look. The link's on the screen or in the show notes if you're listening to the podcast. And we'll be talking about Deep Space, which is a really interesting system that uses cards in the combat. But before we dive into that and talk about that, Ethan, I would love to talk about you and as a gamer and somebody that plays and enjoys games, and what led you to creating Deep Space. So do you remember the first tabletop RPG that you played?
Yeah, I do. What's it called? I guess it might be a bad place for this podcast, but my first RPG was D&D. It
Classic,
was sort of the first one for me. My dad played it when he was a kid, and so when I just started sort of getting into high school, it was something I got involved in, and I sort of very quickly fell in love with it. I have stuck with D&D for a long time through that, but that's mainly just because I've really liked and enjoyed how much you can modify the game and all of these different, I'm sure another system at that point in time would be good, but we always joke that, by the time I graduated high school, basically my friends and I weren't playing D&D anymore. I've always enjoyed, seeing what you can do with a system and kind of just keep expanding on that and adding new rules and new systems and just seeing how far you can go with that. So that's kind of how I grew up and got involved through tabletop RPGs. Is, like I said, originally sort of starting out with D&D and just adding more and more on with that. I had a DM's Guild page, especially throughout COVID, where I went through DM's Guild and just sort of wrote everything to my heart's content until and just basically changing the system as much as I could. So that's sort of how I got involved with tabletop RPGs.
Amazing. So you started writing stuff for D&D on the guild there when that was your first step into publishing. So how did we get to Deep Space? How did that come about?
Yeah, well, so, I've heard that there's a trope that people talk about in game design is that one of the things that you want to do when you design games is you sort of look at what you don't like about the existing system. So that's kind of been my sort of design philosophy, is kind of looking around at my experiences with, not only even just tabletop RPGs, but just media in general that I've interacted with, and just finding what I really like and keeping that, and then kind of changing what I want to change, essentially. So if you go through D&D, through Deep Space, you'll see a lot of inspiration from the original Dungeons and Dragons in sort of a lot of the social encounters and whatnot like that, because I think that system is pretty succinct and I enjoy their check system and whatnot. But then once you get sort of into combat, as well as sort of a macro exploration where you're sort of hex crawls or long-term things, these are systems that sort of the original sort of Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition either I felt didn't touch enough on, in particular with that macro exploration thing I mentioned, or sometimes just had some flaws that when I was originally modifying and publishing my small modifications for original D&D, I sort of would go to great lengths to try and fix these problems until I got, or build around these problems until I sort of was like, oh, why don't I just make my own system?
Yeah, I think I definitely, when you read through the quick start guide, this is very much is not D&D. So I think you can say, I'm sure I know there's a lot you can do with D&D, but I let you say this is modified to the point where it's very much its own system. Let's dive into it and talk about it a little bit. So what is the kind of setting and the setup for Deep Space? So we're guessing it's sci-fi and somewhere in space, but could you give us the little intro into what this game and this world is?
Yeah, so it's sort of it's more of a soft sci-fi. It definitely has fantasy inspiration quite a bit, to the point where I think in the future there are the presence of magic and whatnot is in the world, not necessarily spell casting yet, but in the sense of artifacts and gods and monsters and whatnot, that's all in there. It's not just a very classical an Isaac Asimov type sci-fi. It's more of a fantasy driven. So the setting is it's what's it called? It's referred to as the lost arm of the Kriston galaxy. So it's just 1/4 of a spiral galaxy. It's one big arm basically that has been separated from the rest of it. So that means that the number of worlds and resources is much more diminished than like a normal like galaxy set.
Sure.
So the story is that basically as the different species from the different worlds across the arm sort of gained intergalactic travel and started to spread out, all of their different sci-fi gadgets and whatnot, your starships, your laser rifles, your plasma swords and stuff like that. The one thing that they've sort of very quickly learned is that it takes a lot of energy.
Hmm.
Um, so what happens is that now they essentially built these massive, they're called mega solar generators. They're these basically space station power plants that siphon the heat from a sun
Okay.
in order to produce energy.
Hmm.
But the problem with that is that eventually the sun started going out because they would take so much energy. So now, you have parts of the galaxy where suns are being extinguished as the species across the intelligent species across the galaxy are using them to fuel their ships and weapons and stuff. And so since once you get closer to the center of the arm, or what would be the center of the galaxy, the stars get a lot bigger, they're a lot more dense, and that's where your standard like galactic empire is. So they're the
Hmm.
biggest power and they control the most suns. So they're kind of sitting pretty in how much energy they have. But as you get towards the outside, where there's a lot more sparse energy, you have these sort of more nefarious empires and villainous organizations that are quickly running out of energy and starting to push inwards as they become sort of more desperate for resources and energy.
Fantastic. And what was your inspiration for creating this setting?
There's a lot of different inspiration I've sort of taken. I kind of it's I really like the sort of era of old sci-fi, kind of like Star Wars
Hmm.
era sci-fi, where all the ships are kind of just big plastic toys. So you see
Hmm.
all these like very metal and like it's kind of very grungy a little bit. Another one is like the original Alien movie, like the Nostromo, like all of these
Just
like
what I was thinking from your
yeah,
description. Yeah.
yeah. So all of these is sort of like I think about like rusty, graffiti covered spaceship ruins sort of drifting through the galaxy as, when there's, these ancient giant empires that no longer can sustain themselves and are sort of starting to collapse in on themselves. So it's
Hmm.
kind of that as well as, certain levels of, I guess, modern political pressures of climate change and whatnot that have sort of, I guess, baked themselves into my subconscious. Sort of just this
Hmm.
idea of like, an era past its prime sort of is that for me. So there's definitely some influence of a little bit of horror because I love horror as well.
Hmm.
But yeah, so there's a lot of different kind of like I said, I kind of wanted to just write sci-fi, I guess. So I wouldn't
Yeah.
say I'm necessarily trying to reinvent the wheel with the setting, just because I'm kind of just taking everything that I love about sci-fi and just putting it together, I guess.
Absolutely. No, fantastic. And what sort of characters are we playing when we're playing in the system? Because I saw there was like you said, there was some fancy elements, like there is a dwarf rogue as an option and things like that. So talk us through the kind of characters that we can play when we're playing Deep Space.
Yeah, so it's sort of like I mentioned before. It's definitely a mix of sci-fi and fantasy tropes. Kind of a little similar to like Shadowrun, for example, where it's kind of a mix
Hmm.
of fantasy and sci-fi. And so you do have your standard fantasy, though a lot of them have their own little spins on them. Obviously, I mean, you get the humans, but then your, for example, like your elves. Even though they have fantasy inspiration. And if you look at them at first, they do seem like they are your standard elves. They're
Hmm.
tall, pointy teeth, or sorry, pointy ears, charismatic. But then
Pointy teeth if you want, I guess. Why not? Yeah.
I was going to get there actually because
Oh,
funnily enough,
okay.
they do have their own sort of sci-fi spin. For example, the elves in this case are almost more serpentine, so they do actually
Okay.
have pointy teeth. So,
Gorgeous. Like that twist.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, and so almost kind of like a D&D, like a Yuan Ti, or
Hmm.
for example, the dwarves. They a lot of them they originate from these giant underground societies within their planet, and as you get closer to the core of the planet where they're mining so much, there's sort of a condition that they get called the crust, where they literally have minerals and stones growing on their skin, which makes them more like basically hardened and bulky a little bit, but they're a little bit slower. So kind of, kind of just like another extension past like what you'd see in a normal fantasy environment. Because like, I feel like, for example, the crust thing, I don't think it's necessarily changing the dwarfs, like, or necessarily like where they are it's not necessarily a step in a different direction. It's just kind of a step further from where they go. You got these hardy, basically like warrior guys who are like stocky and powerful, and I think like stone skin kind of goes with that. Or with the elves, you have these tall, silver-tongued, like charismatic people. Makes me very much think of like a charming snake, basically. So even while you do have, some of these original sci-fi species that I've created, there's a lot of homage to the original fantasy origins that I sort of grew up with, but only sort of taken a step up to a new like sci-fi level, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And what sort of roles will we be playing in the game? Like what will these characters be doing? What sort of adventures will be going on in Deep Space?
Yeah, so there's, I've really enjoyed coming up. I have all these different ideas for different modules and whatnot. So I think it's really cool. Part of the reason I like sci-fi is there's so much to do because it's not necessarily locking you into any one thing. A lot of the playtests that I have for now, since a lot of them are focused more on combat because that's where it's the most rules heavy. You have them, more of a standard dungeon crawl. The first one that's currently publicly available is you are crew aboard a ship and then these, the Xylion, they're these like freaky bug people basically, attack your ship and are intent on leaving no survivors. And then this one, the one that you're seeing up right now, is the one that I just recently did a giveaway for and is going to be releasing for free in just a couple of weeks. This one's called Attack on Keldron 8, where instead you are sort of soldiers for an existing military unit going down and investigating an attacked mining site. So while the previous one, you're more of on a Horrors Aboard the Godsend, you're more of like sort of defending your ship from invaders, whereas this one you're coming in to basically stop whatever is going on down there. But even past that, I have a lot of different ideas for future ones. I guess this is something I've never really talked about anywhere other than here, I guess now. My first module, the first module that I intend on trying to release with the start of the game, I have an idea for it. It's called Trench Rats. So this is it's basically almost like a mob thriller.
Okay.
So it takes place in these massive urban mega city that always is very a great setting for crime and deceptive activity basically going on in the undercity. So you have all these different like crime families and different police units trying to take on different things. So you can be doing all these different things within the depths of space, battling on starships and whatnot. But also you can go as far out into the depths of space or as close into a city thriller basically as you want. Or another one I'm thinking of in the future is one where you could be stranded on a jungle planet, for example. There's a lot of obviously since it's sci-fi, using guns and weapons and like firearms is a pretty key part. But there's also systems in place for survival and crafting your own weapons and whatnot. So I think there's a lot of depth in what you could do with that. So that's kind of something I definitely tried to keep in mind when I was building the system.
Absolutely. And when I was reading through the rule book as well, I mean, because it's a sci-fi setting, like you say, with your inspirations, it's got that kind of aliens vibe, or maybe even like Cowboy Bebop, Firefly, that kind of, I don't want to say low-tech sci-fi because that doesn't feel quite right, but you know what I mean? It feels like it's very easy for people to homebrew this and make this their own setting and world and just use the rules as a framework for it. So it feels very easy to kind of make your own stories in this, like, but speaking of which, I'd love to dive into the rule set. And so we've talked about the setting, we've talked about the world and the adventures will be going on. But let's talk about the mechanics and what you've done with the design, because that's what, when I was reading through, interested me and made me want to come on and talk to you about it. So first of all, I'd love you to talk about, because it was a D100 you use for dice checks. So let's talk about if we're in the game and we're wanting to do a thing, how does that work mechanically?
Yeah, so it's pretty much, it's a D100 system, so everything pretty much works in percentages. The general system is the same in the Quick Start Guide. There might be some changes between the Quick Start Guide and the official rules handbook, but this is generally how it's going to be.
Sure. Okay.
So essentially, you have a number of skill points. That's another thing. During character creation, you'll have a skill tree that'll give you different bonuses across it, and that's sort of present on the character sheets. For the Quick Start Guide, I tried to make it as easy to pick up as possible, so all the skill tree is filled out. But in the full game, when you're making your character, you can basically build your skill tree however you want. So basically, for what you'll do is that the DM in advance will set a threshold, basically the success threshold which will be just what you need to roll underneath, essentially. Because since everything works in percentages, a 70% chance of success means that you got to roll under 70. So you take that, and then what happens is that you'll take all of your skill points from the tree. So that's another thing that is sort of cool about the system, is that since it's sort of a tree, when you do it, you get all the bonuses from this particular skill and everything below it. So, for example, if you're making a stealth check, which would be stealth is like a third tier skill, so it goes stealth, and then the larger category is agility, and then the larger category is survival. So when you're making a stealth check, you get your stealth, agility, and survival bonuses. And they all sort of combine to give you a bonus, and then that bonus will raise the threshold. And so the other cool thing that I found that wasn't even intentional, but is a great bonus from the skill tree, is that that means that you get good at adjacent skills. So, sort of going back to that, previous thing. So, if you go all into stealth and then you got agility and your survival, then, another way to branch would be survival, agility, and then like chase, for example.
Sure.
So even if you don't put any points in chase, when you're making a chase check, you still get your points in agility and survival as a bonus towards that. So it sort of makes sense, because if you're, a naturally like agile character, even if you don't put your points into chase, if you're good at other things that are related to being in a chase, it should make sense that your character is also at least sort of good at that. So, yeah. Okay, so that's sort of the base system around that. Sort of that's kind of how I envisioned it. And now, as I'm sort of translating from quick start guides and draft into an official handbook, my goal right now is to just streamline it as much as possible and make it easier and easier to do it.
And what made you choose that system? Because you talked a lot about that you originally started with a lot in D&D, which is like a D20 system. What made you lean towards a D100 system instead?
Yeah, well, so part of it, embarrassingly, is that I just think that using it in percents helps with sci-fi flavor. I think it's just cool to have like a weapon with like 100% accuracy or something like that. Like, I think it just helps with the flavor. And that's honestly been something I've sort of been grappling with, where I'm like, sometimes the system feels clunky. Like, is it good? Like, should I do this? And I'm like, but the percents look kind of cool on this page. So I'm definitely going to stick with the 100 and sort of just see how I can streamline it from there. And also because I just think that it allows for a little bit more of a, precision when it comes to balancing things. So right now, just as I get all the weapons and everything out there, everything is pretty much in intervals of 5. So statistically, it's not that different from a, like a D120 roll. But, given if I really need to, like, make those minute adjustments by tweaking like a percentage just by like a little bit, here and there. Then, I'm sort of able to, as well as make things a little bit more, just because like sometimes it just felt like with the D20, like, like just a +1 would be almost like too much. I was like, I wish there was like a way to add just a little bit less, you know what I mean? Or be a little bit more precise about how you design things. So that's kind of why I picked that.
Nice, I like that. Another thing I obviously want to talk about is a key part of the game was the combat. So you took a really different approach to combat, and you have a card-based system. So I'd love to know why you decided to take that design approach with it.
Yeah, so it sort of was another thing. I guess it just happened to be that while I was designing the game, I happened to be very much into Slay the Spire at the time. And so, I'm thinking about Deepspace, playing Slay the Spire, and I'm thinking like, I mean, nobody's really made this as a combat or in a tabletop situation, other than I guess Slay the Spire, the board game. So I sort of liked it because one of the things that I really wanted to change from D&D is that I felt that whenever I played D&D growing up, I've pretty much always been the dungeon master. I've just been locked in. And so one of the things that I noticed that, when it comes to trying to make sure your players are always engaged is I noticed one of the problems is that a lot of the times, if you're like a melee fighter, essentially, basically what you do is that you kind of move up to the guy and then keep rolling D20s at him until he drops dead. You know what I mean? And now obviously, D&D does have a lot to sort of counteract that. And if you're a creative dungeon master, like that's always something I would do, like adding in different terrain benefits and whatnot like that, different special abilities. I think that there's a lot you can do to sort of get around that. But I sort of just saw that like basically I just thought that having a new system to like have basically a rotating set of abilities that you can do each turn that can dictate
Yeah.
your moves. I
Hmm.
thought would be pretty interesting to try and turn into an RPG setting.
Hmm.
And then from there, I think that it just also adds in like a whole new layer of depth of different things you could do for character creation options. So like for example, when you with the quick start guide, there you have a preset deck that you start with, but in
Hmm.
the full game, there's going to be an appendix of ability cards for each class. So when you're creating your character, you get to pick the combination. It'll basically say like, you get this many primary cards, this many secondary, this many moves and blocks, and then you get 8 ability cards of your choice. So you can
Hmm.
build your deck exactly how you want. So, people who are a little bit more indecisive can theoretically pick, you pick 4 cards, you put 2 of each ability in your deck. But then, when that comes down to it, probability wise, you're
Hmm.
sometimes that means that if you got all these different cards in your deck, you're not going to have the one you need when you want it. So
Hmm.
it might be better to specialize and pick a card, like just a couple cards that you think are good.
Hmm.
As well as, for example, like it adds a whole new layer of buffs and ways to generate advantage because, you have like card draw that basically will, give you more opportunities and things to do. Or, for example, the lieutenant class, a lot of the things that they can do, they can look ahead in their allies' decks and see. So, one of the big ones that I've noticed in playtesting is, the bulwark class who has this big hollow shield basically. And so,
Hmm.
enemies deal a lot of damage in deep space. So, being able to provide cover wherever you want is a really important thing. But the bulwark only has 2 hollow shield cards in his whole deck of 20. So
Okay.
sometimes you'll really be looking for that hollow shield, and like so you're trying to draw cards and look ahead and trying to find that hollow shield so the bulwark can have it and play it so you can gain more ground or take cover or protect an enemy or an ally. And so like I just think that cards are a really cool way to show different you know opportunities and outcomes in a battle. So that's sort of why I want.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of deck builders in board games as well, and it kind of had some elements of that resonated with me as well. So I think people that like that element in board games, that coming across into an RPG, like elements of that, I think will feel quite satisfying. So
Yeah.
just to explain how the cards work, why don't we like kind of walk through a turn in combat and how physically what we're doing with our cards. So we have a deck of cards that we've made, and it was at 20 you say that we'd have,
Yes.
for example. Okay, so it's my turn in combat. I've got a deck of 20 cards sat next to me. What am I doing?
So at the start of your turn, you'll draw 5 cards.
Hmm.
This number does increase over time, but that's sort of where it's at. So you have 5 cards, and you gain 3 energy at the start of your turn. And like I said, as you level up, you also get more energy.
Hmm.
So those are the cards that you can play. So that's the majority of the stuff you can do. Now, much like
Okay.
D&D, in addition to your normal actions, you'll have a speed value that you can move up to independent of your cards. So no matter what happens, you can move even if you don't draw any like move cards. So from there, you'll look at those cards that you have, and you can play any number of them. At least
Hmm.
you spend the energy cost. So you play a card, and you spend the energy that it costs to do that thing essentially. So the most common ones in it are primary cards, which is just you fire whatever weapon is equipped as your primary. Secondary, which is the same thing, but your secondary. And then the 2 you've got up on the screen right now. Move, which is just you move 10 feet. And block, which is gaining temporary SP, which is shield points. So basically, gaining quickly, sort of engaging your armor shields to give you a quick bonus of defense for just a little bit. So those are the base 4. And then past that, you'll have different abilities and whatnot like that. So it'll sort of be, just digging through to find the cards that you want. And then also at the end of your turn, you've got to discard all your cards and draw a new hand at the start of your next turn. So it's sort of, use it or lose it.
Yeah.
So you're in that way, you're sort of constantly cycling through your deck and trying to find it. Once you run out of cards in your draw pile, you just shuffle your discard pile and start again.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's sort of the base system for the cards, but there's a lot of other ways to expand on that. For example, there are grenades and expendable weapons that will add 1 copy to your deck, and once you play it, it just leaves out, it just exits your deck, and then you don't get it. So
Sure, that makes sense.
yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. So I love that deck building element. It feels like combat would be really interesting. How does it change up combat from a more traditional RPG like Dungeons and Dragons? Does it make it faster? Does it make it more tactical? Like what have you seen in playtesting?
Yeah, so I think it definitely makes it more tactical and sort of I've had to tweak a little bit
Hmm.
and learn, but I've definitely noticed that people are using their abilities more
Okay.
to the point where actually sometimes it will become a deficit where people will be a little bit too busy using their ability cards and then they forget to shoot the bad guy.
Hmm.
But it sort of makes it a lot more. It definitely makes it more tactical with because like I said, you're leveraging these abilities. Your support classes are firing off their orders and commands to try and dig up just the right card combinations for your allies and setting up the perfect turn. So your lieutenant is like looking ahead to try to find certain cards for your bulwark, and then your gunner is spending their cards to do certain things. Sometimes
Hmm.
you got to save your cards. There's mechanics where once you play a card, you don't get it for the rest of the combat. So sometimes you got to decide when you're going to spend it. There's a lot more decision making. I don't think it necessarily. It definitely makes turns a little bit longer, but I would say that it keeps them engaging the whole time.
Okay.
Sort of just because you are pretty much always doing something. I think it definitely provides a power boost to characters, especially because a lot of the times that means you can fire theoretically if you're using a weapon that costs 1 energy, you can fire your gun 3 times per turn. So there's definitely
Mhm.
more attacks in a turn. But with the nature, especially given that the you don't have to roll for damage, you just roll for accuracy. There's a little bit less dice rolling, so that definitely keeps it a little bit slower, as well as I sort of work to streamline it a little bit more and make sure that the calculations and whatnot aren't too like complex.
Mhm.
Essentially, it should ultimately, like I said, be a little bit longer, but also keep them relatively even, especially are engaging. Especially because one thing I heard, I had someone who I play tested with someone who had never even played an RPG before in their life.
Oh wow, okay.
And they said that the cards were a really good benefit because you're looking at your hand and you're seeing exactly what you could do on your turn. It sort of
Yeah.
explains it right there for you instead of for example, what's it called, DnD, where you've got the big list of all the different actions you can take, and it's like, well, what's the best option? You're like, I don't really know.
Yeah.
But when you got the cards right in front of you, I think it makes it a lot more like easy to figure out what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, I mean, piggybacking off that comment, where would you say Deep Space is in terms of complexity? So, if somebody's used to playing Dungeons and Dragons, would you say it's more or less, or where would you place it?
I think it's kind of hard. I want to say that it's like my first like thing that comes to mind is that at least what I want it to be is really easy to pick up, but has a lot of depth. Um,
Sure.
I think that it's I think it's in a solid area of that. I'd say it's
Mhm.
probably a little bit more complex than D&D.
Okay.
Just because there are ultimately more rules in the future. I do have more
Hmm.
rules for planned for long-term exploration or downtime and whatnot that are a little bit
Hmm.
more complex. Where you're negotiating resources and whatnot. Obviously, there are a lot more cards, but there are less classes and whatnot. So I think it's a little bit more complex than D&D, but I guess I would like to think at least that it's a little bit easier explained and easier to pick up.
Sure. And at the moment, I mean, you've got the Quick Start Guide available on itch, which people can download for free and have the Quick Start Guide and have a look through. And like you say, you've got some like free adventures and stuff going on. What are your future plans for the game? And if people are interested from listening to this, how can they get involved?
Yeah, well, so right now, I'm so Deep Space has been, I only sort of released it like about a month and a half ago, but it's been
Mhm.
about a year-long project for me. I started about last year, so right now I currently have a absolutely uh, unorganized 200-page Google Drive of all of my notes of what I plan on doing for the game, or like all of the
Mhm.
rules and whatnot. So, I've already got pretty much all the classes planned out in their progression. I've got pretty much all the starter weapons. I think there's about 50 starter weapons. Most of the
Mhm.
rules, I have all the rules for starships. All of that is sort of already planned out. But obviously, like I said, all it is right now is just a very messy Google Drive.
Mhm.
So right now, I'm in the process of getting the official book sort of published and or at least formatted in a professional publishing software. So that's my progress right now. It's sort of doing that, and then as well as so while I sort of make the game a little bit more presentable, I guess, to maybe hopefully a publisher at one point in time. Right now, I'm sort of releasing small different bits of contest or of content and playtests, and I plan on hosting playtests and whatnot like that in the future. And so all of that sort of is happening alongside my development. So right now, the big thing is that right now I have social medias on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram, all of which are in the link tree right there. Just linktree/Flaming River. So following that along and sort of joining the community is right now. It's my main goal is sort of just building a community around the game. Like I said, everything's free. There's no barrier to entry. Everything is printable, quick start, super easy to pick up. So right now, my goal is to just get people to sort of hop on the bandwagon, follow along, and just sort of join in. So you can follow all my social medias, even just play testing the game, giving it a rating. I've got a mailing list as well. Sort of just following along. There's like I said, there's not much of a barrier to entry. Everything's free. Everything's totally available. So yeah, that's sort of my goal right now. Just building a community while I officially get the book sort of formatted.
That sounds great, and good plans for if you want to do a crowdfunding campaign to self-publish it in the future. You'll have
definitely
a bunch of people following along. That sounds great. Ethan, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about Deep Space. I was really excited to see this in development and the place where it's at now. So I'm really glad to get to speak to you about it. The last question I have for you, which I ask everybody, is if you have any recommendations for games, and the rules are it can't be D&D and it can't be a game that you've made.
Okay, well, I've only made one game, so that's good. I think that one game that I sort of, like I said, most of my origins were in D&D 5e. So actually being able to learn about different games and whatnot that while I publish the game has been really fun. One that I haven't gotten to play yet, but I've absolutely fallen in love with the vibes is Mothership RPG. It was also originally an indie RPG, I guess. It was like, a very popular success story, basically. I think that their rules are really interesting for a pretty cool system. I like that it's pretty succinct in their rules. It's pretty light on rules, which I think is really interesting. And something I'd definitely be interested in trying. I do like the idea that it's super easy to make a character just because you're basically going through the meat grinder and just your character making it through a session is like an achievement basically for a character. So I think that's pretty cool, and having the rules be pretty succinct. And I think it really lends to their art is phenomenal. I just think that they're just the environment that they've built has I've absolutely fallen in love with. So that's definitely one that I'm really excited to try. I've read through it a couple times. So that would be the one that I'm currently interested in, Mothership. So that's what I'd say.
I love that recommendation as Mothership. I also love that game. I played it a lot. It works really well for one-shot sessions. So just a one-off quick game. But yeah, so I like that recommendation. Thanks so much. Okay. Well, thank you so much again for coming on. It was great having you. Keep us updated on the game. And if you're going to a crowdfunder when the full game's out, please do let us know. But yeah, wish you all the best of luck with the development of it. And
awesome. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone that's watched and listened as well. That's all for this week, but we'll be back next week with another indie tabletop RPG to share with you. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.